Hey everybody, Ruckdog back for the next installment of the Dystopian Wars 3.0 Captain's Academy. And now it's time for you to sail me closer so I can hit them with my sword. We're talking about assaults. Everybody, so assaults. This is one of the more dramatic parts of the game. It has been for, well, really since Dystopian Wars first came out all those years ago. And so for today's video, I'm looking forward to kind of illuminating how the assault rules work under the new edition. So let's go ahead and get into it. So here's the topics we're going to be talking about. We'll look at the basic terminology that we're going to be using for the rest of the video. Then we're going to be looking at a few of the requirements that you have to satisfy in the new rules to be able to even execute an assault. And then we'll actually walk through a whole example of an assault using a couple of representative models, just so you can see how those mechanics work in real time, so to speak. Then we'll be talking about some considerations and observations, and finally, as I usually do, I'll be talking briefly about some comparisons between assaults in Dystopian Wars 3.0 and boarding actions, as they were known previously in older editions of the rules. Alright, so just to sort of set the scene, we're looking at assaults happening here at the very end of the unit activation phase. Now, unit activations include things like special operations, movement, and shooting. So we are going to be doing all of the actions for that before we get to the assaults. So just kind of remember that if you're going to assault a target, you have to move close enough to it during the movement part of the activation in order to be able to then execute your assault phase at the end. So terms, initial target. Well, as you might guess, this is what is going to be assaulted. These are the destinations for your assault marines as they take off from your models and go after an enemy. The assault team model is going to be somewhat similar to the lead unit in a shooting attack. And then the supporting models, likewise, are going to be members of the assaulting model's unit that are lending their support to the assault. Now, what do you need to be able to satisfy requirements-wise in order to be able to actually do an assault in the game? Well, you have to have a model within 4 inches of your initial target. And remember, that has to be at the end of your activation. So you have to have already planned out your movement such that you're close enough to the target you want to assault to be able to do so. Models can only launch 1 assault per turn. And likewise, if a model is supporting an assault being made by another member of its unit, it cannot then do an assault of its own. So really, you're sort of limited to 1 assault action per turn, whether that's leading an assault from that model or supporting another model from the same unit in the assault that that model is making. There are some limitations, some things that you just can't do. So if you're an aerial model, you cannot assault a submerged model. So no airship to submarine assault action. Likewise, there's no submarine to airship action. However, both of those models can assault other units of their same type, or they can assault surface units. And submerged units cannot assault ground units, and ground units are only able to assault each other. Sorry, I skipped ahead there a little too fast. All right, so for our example here, we're going to say that 4 Commonwealth Frigates, represented by those little blue shapes there, are going to be assaulting an enlightened Descartes control ship, which is being represented by the red shape. So first thing you have is you have to check range. You can essentially think of all of these frigates as having a little 4-inch bubble. And as long as the frigate's 4-inch bubble actually touches some part of the Descartes control ship, then they are considered to be within range for the assault. Notice that the ranges are measured from the center point of the assaulting models to any point of the target model. So as you can see, we have 3 frigates that satisfy that 4-inch range requirement. However, the 4th frigate is too far away. It's just not quite close enough to the Descartes to be able to lend its support to the assault. Alright, so for the assaulting unit, let's look at some key stats. Here is the card for the Ruckdog frigates. We're going to be paying attention to the fray value. That's essentially a measure of how strong that unit is at boarding. And we're also going to be paying close attention down there at the bottom where it talks about any applicable special rules. In this case, Pack Hunter definitely provides some additional dice for assaults And so this is something that's going to come into play here during the example. All right, so let's figure out how many dice we get to use in order to assault the Descartes. We only have 3 or 4 frigates within range. So one of those frigates will lead the assault, and it's going to get its full fray value of 5 dice. We have 2 other frigates, and they get to contribute 2 dice apiece. And then finally, Pack Hunter triggers, which gives you +1 die for each model involved. So that's going to be a total of 3 more dice. So add that all together with the initial model's fray value, +2 from the first supporting model, +2 more from the second supporting model. Finally, 3 more from Pack Hunter leaves you with 12 total assault dice for the attack on the Descartes. So now we're going to take those 12 dice and we're going to roll them, and we're going to be looking at the results of those dice as normal. All right, so all 12 dice come out. We're going to pay attention to just the hits. You'll see that we've got a exploding dice here, so we get to roll another one. Yep, and look at that, another exploding hit. However, the dice we roll from that's just a blank, and so it gets ignored. And now we take a look at all the hits we got. So from this, we see we got 2 exploding hits, so those are counting for 2 each. Then we had 2 heavy hits for 2 hits each. And then finally, we had 2 hits with just 1 hit each. Add all that together, and we have a total of 10 hits. Now, the model that's being assaulted doesn't have to take this lying down. It can actually do some things to defend itself. So you get to try and reduce those number of hits by rolling a defensive dice pool. The stats we're going to be paying attention to on this one include the Citadel value and the defense values. We're going to take the highest of either the submerged or the aerial defense. Now, in this case, they're both the same. And in all honesty, you're going to find that's probably going to be true more often than not, at least going by the Orbats and the unit cards we've seen so far. But in the event that your aerial defense and your submerged defense are different, then you're going to want to select the higher of the 2. And then we're going to add those 2 values together. So in this case, we're going to be looking at 11 plus 7, giving a total of 18 total dice. And then we're going to roll that dice pool. Now, excuse me here as I struggle to keep all the dice in frame. We roll 18 dice, and we're just looking for those blue shields, both the singles and the doubles. Those are your heavy counters with the double shields, and your regular counters with just the single shields. All right, so we separate out all the counters, put them all together. And now we go and add them up. So the heavy counters count as 2 each. Single counters count as 1 each. So we have 6 plus 4 equals 10. All right, so now we have to determine the results of the assault. So for that, we take both the number of hits and the number of counters, and we subtract the 2 and see if there's any remainder. So we had 10 hits, and we subtract 10 counters, which gives us a big old goose egg. There were 0 left over, which means that we had a draw, and there's no effect on either participant. So everybody goes home and licks their wounds and presumably lives to fight another day. Now, and we'll note here about the assault table, you see that obviously the more hits you have left over, the worse it's going to be for the model that's being assaulted. So definitely want to roll high if you're the assaulting model. A couple of other considerations I want to briefly mention. SRS tokens. Those can be used to boost both the assault offense and the assault defense. Each token that you have in base contact with a friendly or enemy model can be discarded to add an additional dice to your action dice pool. So if I'm a model and I'm being assaulted by this group of frigates, if that Descartes had, say, 3 SRS tokens in base contact, it could choose to discard those 3 tokens and get an additional 3 dice to roll as part of its defensive dice pool. Likewise, if one or more of those frigates had SRS tokens attached, they could sacrifice or expend those tokens to gain additional assault dice. So there are some cards out there in the Victory and Valor deck that can boost this. For example, there's one card that allows you to count your hits as well as your counters when you're rolling a defensive roll. That could be a huge boost to your defensive abilities during a particular assault. So that's important to kind of keep in mind as you're playing your assaults, is to pay attention to what cards you have and also sort of be thinking about what cards your opponent might have as well. What you'll notice as your models get crippled is that their defense and their citadel values tend to go down, which means that crippled models are much more susceptible to assaults than the battle-ready models are in comparison. And then finally, a few observations here. So, as you saw in the example, it's not all that hard for defense pools to have more dice than the attack pools. Now, that seems like it makes defense a lot more powerful than offense. Mitigating that, though, is the fact that your attack dice explode, whereas your defense dice do not. And so, therefore, it's a lot easier to get more hits with your attack dice, even though their numbers might be a bit more limited. Shredded defenses is really bad. It makes your model a big old fat juicy target for an assault because it removes 1/3 to half of your defensive dice from having your defenses knocked offline. And then as you saw here in the example that I did for this video, it really seems like Mass 1 models don't really pose too much of a threat to Mass 3 models. It seems like there's almost a plus or minus 1 to your mass value in effect as far as your boarding threat. And what I mean by that, if you're a Mass 1 model unit, you can be a credible threat to a Mass 2 unit, but not necessarily to a Mass 3 unit. Likewise, if you're a Mass 2 unit, you're kind of a threat to both your Mass 1 units and your Mass 3 units, provided you have multiple units in that Mass 2, or I'm sorry, multiple models, I should say, in that Mass 2 unit. So a squadron of 3 cruisers, for example, can still pose a threat to even a Mass 3 model, whereas a single cruiser by itself, maybe not so much. All right, so as I have been tending to do for these videos, let's take a brief moment and talk about how assaults stack up to the boarding actions of previous editions. Overall, assaults are cheaper in Dystopian Wars 3.0. And what I mean by cheaper is not so much in terms of point cost, but more in terms of opportunity costs. There's a lot less downside to doing your assaults in Dystopian Wars 3.0. You can shoot at a target and also assault it in the same turn. You don't have to worry about losing AP, assault points, in older versions of Dystopian Wars. For those of you that don't know, each model had a certain number of assault points, and those could be lost either by conducting assaults or by defending from assaults, which meant that if you made an assault and you lost a bunch of AP, that made the parent model a lot more vulnerable to being assaulted in turn because they were essentially expending their resources in offense rather than sort of husbanding some for defense. So that means that there's less risk overall to the assaulting model. And as you saw as well with the results table, the very absolute worst that can happen to a model that's leading an assault is it suffers 1 point of damage. So all in all, not too bad. Assaults are generally less destructive, again going back to the table, unless you just happen to get massive amounts of hits on a lucky roll. You're not likely to sort of outright destroy or completely knock out of action a model with a boarding assault. It can kind of be a little bit of a coup de grace for a model that's already heavily damaged in 3.0, but it's not going to be a difference maker in and of itself. And then one big difference is that it's no longer possible to capture or prize models. In older versions of Dystopian Wars, if you won your assault or your boarding action, you could actually take over your opponent's model. Now, you wouldn't be able to move and shoot with it, but you could get a lot of extra victory points from having control of that model at the end of the game. And it also provides sometimes an incentive for your opponent to try and reboard and take back their ship. So that whole element of the game has been removed. A little bit sad to see it go, especially as a Prussian, now Imperium player. Boarding and prizing models was sort of one of the things that the Imperium was always fond of doing. But at the same time, it's another streamlining to the rule set that removes another type of bookkeeping that oftentimes had to be maintained from round to round. You had to keep track of how many assault points you had on the model, and then if you got counter-assaulted, you might lose a few, but you still had some on there, so you had to keep track of that. So from that perspective, it is a reasonable change because it simplifies that little bit of bookkeeping that you used to have to do. Speaking of complexity, the older editions of Dystopian Wars, starting with Dystopian Wars 2.0 and continuing into 2.5, ships were assigned crew qualities, so things like conscript or elite, that type of thing. And those crew qualities made those ships better or worse in a boarding action. That whole element has been removed, at least for now, from Dystopian Wars 3.0. I can't rule out the possibility of it being added back in at some later date through an expansion or some other revision. But at least for now, that's been removed from the game, which is, again, a further simplification and streamlining of 3.0 compared to previous editions. Now it seems like the crew quality is more or less being accommodated for with things like the Pack Hunter special rule like we saw, and also just in terms of raw amount of fray that a particular unit gets. So that'll pretty much wrap it up for this video. As you saw, we talked about basic terms and the requirements for an assault. We gave an example. We talked about considerations. I gave some observations. And finally, a little bit of a comparison with previous editions of Dystopian Wars. So that will about wrap it up for the 4th episode of the Dystopian Wars Captain's Academy. Thank you all so much for watching. Apologies on this video being a little bit later than I had liked. I had hoped to try and get it out at least a few days earlier than I did. My apologies. Real life keeps getting in the way. Hopefully video number 5, which I plan on doing all about carriers and SRS tokens, will be along here within another week or so. But, you know, real life, again, might interfere. Well, anyway, I appreciate you guys sticking around to the end. And this is Ruckdog saying, until next time, good luck and good hunting.